to this evening's program, the Boston Massacre, Blood in the Snow, sponsored by the Friends of the Library and presented by our distinguished guest speaker and well-known and well-loved Weston Library lecturer, retired Justice Dennis J. Curran, who served as a Massachusetts Superior Court judge for 15 years, presiding over 450 civil and criminal trials. Justice Curran has received 4 statewide awards for judicial excellence and mentored over 100 judicial student interns, forming deep connections with many who still keep in touch with him. He is a graduate of Boston Latin School and received his bachelor's and master's degrees in an accelerated joint degree program from the University of Pennsylvania and his law degree from the University of Virginia. Justice Curran has served as a professor of the practice at Tufts University and teaches at Brown University's summer program. Currently, he works as an arbitrator and gives enrichment lectures for the luxury cruise lines traveling all around the world. On behalf of everyone at the library, I am honored to present Justice Curran.
Good evening and welcome. Tonight's story features both a hero and a villain. The hero is a young attorney, John Adams, who 30 years later would become the second president of the United States. And the villain, the man who, despite the fame accorded to him in the mid-19th century poem, Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, many historians have discovered was one of the first intellectual property thieves in American history. Paul Revere, or Revere in his French Huguenot. But more about Revere later. John Adams was a young attorney who undertook the notoriously unpopular criminal defense of the captain of the British soldiers charged in the Boston Massacre trials. Adams courageously took that case in the face of overwhelming and vehement opposition of his fellow Bostonians, his friends, and even his own family. Adams was considered a traitor to the colonial cause by many of his fellow colonists, even by his own cousin, Sam Adams. In representing what Bostonians considered villainous defendants, John Adams epitomized the word professionalism. When an attorney is called upon by his duty and his oath to represent the most unpopular of clients because they deserve representation. And here's how he saw his duty. To what higher object, to what greater character can any mortal aspire than to be possessed of all this knowledge, to assist the feeble and friendless, to procure redress of wrongs, and to assert and maintain liberty and virtue. At the time, John Adams, as all the founders were politically ambitious. But he thought that defending those soldiers would kill any political ambition that he could have. So let's turn to our story tonight. It is a snowy winter in 1770, but the cold belies a boiling Boston cauldron seething with resentment that this fellow, King George, that's the way, by the way, I walk around my house. King George had massively infused Boston with British troops into the town of Boston. I say town because it was indeed a town, not recognized as a city until 1822. This sketch shows the British ships in Boston Harbor, but it's a period piece, but it really doesn't do justice to the many, many more ships that were anchored in the Boston Harbor at the time. There were over 4,000 British soldiers headquartered for duty in the town of Boston. And that meant that there were 3 British soldiers for every Boston home. 3 British soldiers for every Boston home. Just weeks before the Boston Massacre, a Tory, who's a person, as you may remember, loyal to the crown, shoots and kills a schoolboy. The people are enraged. Radical revolutionary Sam Adams organizes the funeral, and all hell is about to break loose in Boston. Bostonians bitterly resent the constant British presence for 3 reasons. First, the British soldiers are paid a meager wage by the crown, if at all, and as a result are forced to take odd jobs to make ends meet. And in doing so, they undercut the wages expected by native Bostonians, many of whom were simply trying to support their family. Second, the British Navy, which needs manpower, often kidnaps men off the street and presses them into service on British ships. And British law allows them to do just that. And finally, Bostonians detest the British soldiers who have the right to be quartered in their homes. And eventually, that leads, as you may remember from your history books, to the enactment of the Third Amendment to the Bill of Rights in the United States Constitution, which declares, no soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. But the British troops' feelings toward Bostonians are mutual. General Thomas Gage's opinion of the colonists is typical, calling them a lawless and licentious lot. The troops, he said, are here contrary to the wishes of the council, the colonial assembly, the magistrates, and the people. And the troops seem only to suffer ruin and abuse. What is, by the way, licentious? It's not a word that I use every day. I do remember it from school many years ago. So I looked it up just to determine what it meant, and it meant sexually promiscuous. So that's what they were calling Bostonians. I haven't run into any of these people, but I guess they exist supposedly in Thomas Gage's mind 255 years ago. So our story begins 3 weeks ago and 255 years ago on Friday, March 2nd, 1770. Now remember that date, please. March 2nd, it's a Friday, when a British soldier is looking for part-time work. And he enters a building that looks like this. This is called a rope walk. What is a rope walk? Well, it's a long, narrow lane or covered pathway, as this one. This one is actually in Charlestown. And I happened to look up this afternoon as to whether it's, I know I've seen it many, many times growing up. I wanted to check to see if it still exists. And indeed, some developers bought it in 2017 and converted it into apartments. 17 apartments are going to be for low income, but they've all been hollowed out. In any event, that is a rope walk. Now, what is a rope walk? Well, it's a place where long strands of material are laid before being twisted into rope. Why do we have rope walks in Boston? Because Boston was a port city like New York and Philadelphia, and rope is essential for sailing ships. This is the HMS Victory, a British naval vessel. Its requirements for rope are about 1,000 feet, and Boston, as a thriving seaport, has dozens and dozens of rope walks that dot the harbor. Actually, I've looked at old maps of colonial Boston. The particular one that I've seen is from 1770, and there are probably, I must have counted 30 different rope walks dotting the harbor of Boston. Well, going back to this rope walk incident, the owner of the rope walk insults the soldier who was simply looking for work. And this is what he says. You can read it as well as I. We then go clean out my whatever. All right, a riot quickly breaks out. Soldiers quickly surrounded and cheered by the rope makers. He returns to the guardhouse just 2 blocks away, where the Boston Massacre will take place 3 days later. And he tells his fellow soldiers what's just happened. Now, it is this rope walk incident that sparks the historic confrontation just 3 days later on Monday night. Remember, this is a Friday. Word of the rope walk confrontation spreads throughout town, mainly through the taverns. That's where most of the social life was conducted, as you may or may not know. Tension builds within the town of Boston throughout the weekend. And here is a timeline. Oh, there's the rope walk incident. And here's a timeline of events that led to the Boston Massacre, so you can see. Rope walk incident, early morning, early evening, Saturday and Sunday, people are talking about it. Early evening, men stream into the city of Boston, and they're looking for trouble, and about 9 o'clock is when the Boston Massacre occurs on King's Street, which is now known as State Street. We don't have King any longer, so they decided when we took over, as colonists did, to the Patriot cause, that they named it State Street. So, on that Monday, things go from bad to worse. It is that evening of Monday, March 5th, 1770. It's chilly. Chunks of frozen snow and ice are on the sidewalks and streets of Boston, including King Street. And this is a sketch of the old, what was called the townhouse. The townhouse. That was actually rather interesting. The first floor of that was where they sold sheep and ducks and geese and cows. And there's also a post office there. On the second and third floor were reserved for the royal governor and the legislature, such as it was. And in fact, the judges met up there as well. But that building still stands, and it's now called the Old State House. Well, the problems begin in the early evening when, in front of the townhouse, which we now call, as I said, the Old State House, a wigmaker's apprentice starts heckling a British soldier over a supposedly unpaid bill. And here is where the altercation takes place, right here between the British soldier and the young colonist. And there was a tavern located over here that virtually everybody drank at. By the way, my law office, when I was practicing law, was right over here, looking directly into the windows of the Old State House. So here's what happens. The wigmaker's apprentice yells out to the soldier that he had never paid for a wig his master had made for him. Now, in those days, accusing someone of not paying a bill in public is a relatively serious accusation. So, needless to say, the soldier was profoundly embarrassed by this altercation. The apprentice trails the soldier as he returns to the British guardhouse and taunts him mercilessly. Another soldier who is on sentry duty hears these repeated accusations, as do others, and says, "He is a gentleman, and if he owes you anything, he will pay for it." To which the colonist replies, "There is no such thing as a gentleman in this regiment." The sentry's hackles go up. He advances towards the apprentice. Heated words are exchanged, and the sentry strikes the apprentice with the butt of his musket, knocking him to the ground. By the way, the truth about this so-called unpaid bill is that, in fact, it had been paid. The apprentice was not in the shop when the soldier had actually gone in to pay the bill. But never mind, it didn't really matter. That's the sort of thing that starts needless fights. Many times I see this sort of misunderstanding in cases that came before me. But in any event, a small crowd gathers, attracted by the taunting and the altercation. They surround the lone sentry and heckle him. Crowd quickly grows to 50 people, and some young men throw ice at the sentry. The guard retreats from the sentry box to the custom house steps and loads his gun. Sentry waves his gun, frantically knocks at the guardhouse door and yells for help. And in the meantime, two other crowds are gathering nearby. Tempers are flaring. The crowds are heckling the British soldiers. Bloody lobster back, lousy rascal, lobster son of a gun. And as you can see, their backs look like, boiled lobster. Fights are now breaking across all the city. One man exhorts a mob in Dock Square to march upon the soldiers' headquarters. Another crowd streams down an alley. Someone starts ringing the fire bell, bringing dozens more people onto the streets. Now, the British officer of the day is a Captain Thomas Preston. Confronted with this quickly spiraling chaos, he paces in front of the British guardhouse, unsure of what to do. He knows that the soldiers have no right to use arms against the citizenry unless specifically authorized by a magistrate. But if he does nothing, the mob might kill the sentry. Captain Preston makes his decision and barks out an order to his soldiers to turn out against the mob. Turn out, he orders, main guard. 7 soldiers turn out, half of them with their uniforms not on. Preston moves the men in columns of 2 across King Street with muskets and fixed bayonets. They push through the crowd of now 50 to 100 civilians near the customs house, finally reaching the surrounded entry. Preston orders the sentry to fall into line and starts marching his men back to the main guard, but the crowd surrounds and blocks them. Hemmed in, soldiers line up in a semicircle facing the crowd, who are hurling chunks of ice, coal, and believe it or not, oyster shell. Although I don't know how hard an oyster shell, can hurt you. Anyway, Captain Preston orders the crowd to disperse, but they're having none of it. Enter into our story Crispus Attucks, a sailor from one of the commercial ships in the harbor who's in port that evening. He steps forward, wielding a club, grabs a soldier's bayonet and knocks him to the ground. Humiliated, the soldier yells, "Damn you, fire!" And in spurts and with no coordination, the soldiers fire leaden balls into the crowd. Several soldiers load their weapons and prepare to fire again, but Preston orders them to stop firing. And if I can get the volume to work on this, pray that it does, we'll see a reenactment of that.
The investigation into the Boston Massacre begins here on Boston Comment. To separate truth from propaganda, we asked actors to reenact the events based on eyewitness statements.
We need this much space to make this line.
Reenactments of eyewitness accounts may show us if the events were physically possible.
When you come in as a mob, you're going to actually be close.
We hope to discover where different sets of testimony agree and where they diverge.
These bayonets are down live steel. You cannot let your attention drift on the bayonet.
The forensic team can focus on the places where the witness statements differ. The shooting involved 8 British enlisted men and 1 officer. The actors portraying the soldiers have reproduced as accurately as possible the uniforms and weapons of the period, including this brown vest musket. As night falls, the actors gather in front of the old State House. The busy city street has been blocked for the reenactment of the Boston Massacre, where it occurred long ago.
Turn right the boat. Right?
The weather on the night of the reenactment is moderate, but on March 5th, 1770, the temperature was unusually cold, well below freezing, with a blanket of icy snow covering the ground. That evening, a British sentry, Private Hugh White, was guarding the customs house located here. Around 8 p.m., a young apprentice, Edward Garrett, began to taunt White. The taunting continued until White struck Garrett with the butt of his musket. Garrett fell to the ground. Word of the incident swept through the town. A swarm of angry citizens descended on the square. Many of them had been drinking in the local taverns. The crowd surrounded the sentry and threatened him with bodily harm. While the entire town appeared to be erupting, Captain Thomas Preston was in the main barracks across the street from the old State House, close enough to hear Sentry White call for help. Captain Preston marched in with 6 privates in a courtroom. The British rescue team reached White and attempted to escort him back to the barracks, but they were stopped by a mob of up to 300 angry citizens. Hemmed in by the crowd, Preston ordered his troops into a semicircle formation and took a position in front of his men. Several people in the crowd dared the soldiers to shoot, yelling fire over and over.
It made the British soldiers feel like they didn't have any courage. You know, they're wanting to fire, they're wanting to answer that call, but they can't. And the crowd knows they can't, so they're daring them.
The demonstration turned lethal when Patriot Richard Holmes struck a soldier, Private Hugh Montgomery, with a stick. Montgomery fell to the ground, then rose up and fired. The Boston Massacre began moments later. The other soldiers let loose a fusillade of musket fire. 11 colonials fell.
Once they fired, the mob retreated. So the soldiers reloaded their weapons, and as the mob had come back in to retrieve their wounded, the soldiers thought that the mob was advancing on them to do them harm. They leveled their muskets at the crowd as if to fire again. When Preston saw this, he immediately knocked up their muzzles, yelling, "Don't fire, stop, don't fire." Preston ordered the men into a column of 2s and then marched them back to the main guard.
Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, and other Patriot leaders quickly claimed that the violent confrontation had been a massacre, a symbol of...
The Boston Massacre immediately claims 4 dead, including Crispus Attucks, about whom we'll talk a little more later on. Another victim dies within days. Word of the shooting reaches acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who lives, by the way, in the North End. He rushes to King Street. He finds an angry mob and a shaken Captain Preston, and he speaks with Captain Preston before addressing the crowd, then mounts the balcony at the State House, or the old townhouse, pleads for calm, and announces, "Let the law have its course. I will live and die by the law." After midnight, the sheriff obtains a warrant for the arrest of Captain Preston. He undergoes a preliminary hearing during the night, and in the morning, he's charged with murder. Preston is jailed where he remain until his trial ensues some 7 months later. Let's move on, if we may, to the rush for a narrative. The Boston Town Meeting, which is a group of citizens who govern Boston under the authority of the king, quickly acts to develop and shape a narrative to influence the outcome of the trial. For example, here's a Boston newspaper, the Boston Gazette. As you can see, this is 1 week after March 12, 1770. It's 1 week after the event. And the town meeting appoints a commission or a committee to assemble an account to deliver to what they call key figures in London. Witness statements are taken at Faneuil Hall. A preliminary hearing is held, and when people hear that the judges have decided to delay a trial of the British soldiers, a committee of town leaders composed principally of, on the left, Sam Adams, and on the right, Dr. Joseph Warren, who really was a remarkable figure in the American Revolution. He dies at the Battle of Bunker Hill later. But they are accompanied by a mob, and they break in while the judges are holding a preliminary hearing on the case, disrupt the court hearing, and start haranguing and almost get into fisticuffs with the judges. Several of the judges refuse to conduct business there ever again. On to the defense attorneys. Captain Preston quickly recruits a lawyer. Many lawyers, by the way, refused the case, but through intermediaries, he eventually gets John Adams to represent him. When word gets out, Adams endures withering criticism from the townspeople. Adams' own father is outraged by his son's decision to take the case. And Adams responds that the soldiers deserve counsel and are presumed innocent until proven guilty. And here is what Adams later says about his decision to defend Captain Preston. Counsel ought to be the very last thing that an accused person would want in a free country. The bar ought to be independent and impartial at all times and in every circumstance. Persons whose lives were at stake ought to have the counsel they prefer. This trial would be as important a cause as ever was tried in any court or country of the world. Now, how prophetic was that? Because 255 years ago, we're gathered here on this evening to discuss this very trial. But as sometimes happens, as lawyers know, the client, Captain Preston, doesn't do anything to help himself. In fact, he writes a long, self-serving, and inflammatory account disparaging the people of Boston, who are going to be his jurors, by the way. And he sends it off to England. London's newspapers pick it up and run with it. And in a couple of weeks, a ship returns from England to Boston with the London newspapers, and the townspeople are enraged to further read about what Captain Preston wrote about them. On to the trial. This is an actual sketch that I found of the gathering at the trial. It took 6 days, by the way. At the trial, Adams, now he's defending just Captain Preston, not the other soldiers. That's going to be a trial that's conducted 3 weeks thereafter. Adams cleverly narrows the legal issue to that of self-defense and argues the following. Self-preservation is the first law of nature. Self-love is the strongest principle in our breasts, and self-preservation is not only our inalienable right, but our clearest duty by the law of nature. And at the trial, the judge instructs the law on self-defense using these words, using words that are similar to this. A person is allowed to act in self-defense if evidence of self-defense is present. The Commonwealth, meaning the Crown in those days, must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant did not act in self-defense. In other words, if you have a reasonable doubt whether or not the defendant acted in self-defense, your verdict must be not guilty. Now, the reason I put those words up there, those weren't the actual words, word for word, that the trial judge used, but those are the words that have come down to us over 255 years. And that is the actual jury instruction that all trial judges would use if you were to walk into the Dedham District Court or the Norfolk Superior Court, in any case, or any court in the Commonwealth. Those are the precise words that are uttered by a trial judge instructing a jury on the issue of self-defense. Then almost word for word, those are the words uttered by the judge 255 years ago. So when some people kind of laugh when they say, well, that's an old law. Well, old law can be good law, as evidenced by the self-defense statement. So here's an excerpt from John Adams's defense.
And for the prisoners at the bar. In the words of the Marquis of Curran, if by supporting the rights of mankind, I shall save from the agonies of death one unfortunate victim of tyranny or of ignorance equally fatal, his blessings will be sufficient consolation to me for the contempt of all mankind. When people are taxed without representation, they are sometimes to feel abused. And sometimes they may even rebel. But we must take care, lest, borne away by a torrent of passion, we make shipwreck of conscience. Prisoners must be judged solely upon the evidence produced against them in court and by nothing else. And the evidence we have heard speaks plainly enough, gentlemen. A sentry's post is his castle, and to attack it by English law is an illegal act. Soldiers so assaulted may defend themselves to the death. The people crying, kill them, knock them down. And the heathen sharp, cutting ice, oyster shells, clubs. What are they to do? Behave like stoic philosophers lost in apathy? Disregard these uniforms. Consider the men who wear them. Consider yourselves in such a situation and judge if a reasonable man would not fear for his life. Facts are stubborn things. See, whatever our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictums of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. You see, the law, on the one hand, is inexorable to the cries and lamentations of the prisoners, but on the other hand, it is deaf as an adder to the clamors of the populace. Gentlemen of the jury, I submit to your candor and justice the prisoners and their cause.
The trial was 6 days in length, and the jury finds Captain Preston not guilty on the grounds of self-defense. And in what was later called the soldiers' trial, several weeks later, 6 of the soldiers are found not guilty, but 2 are found guilty. Guilty of manslaughter. Now, in a clever legal strategy, and something that only could come from the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, Adams plead as a sentence for these 2 individuals convicted of manslaughter, the benefit of clergy. What is that, you might say? Well, that's a historic plea when the clergy were found guilty of a crime in a regular court. I'll spell it out for you. It meant that you didn't have to serve time in prison if you could recite sections of the Bible, read sections of the Bible. Hey, that's the way they were. I couldn't make this stuff up, but also subject yourself to branding in court. That meant that the individual was hauled in, his hand was placed in a fastener tightly, an iron was warmed up, emblazoned, and then the letter M was branded on your thumb for either, or your palm actually, for either murder or, as the case here, manslaughter. Also, the letter T that I've shown you here is for thievery. This is a thief. So, let's look back at this in a holistic sense. How does history record this dramatic event? Well, the story has echoed through newspapers, our history books, and pamphlets for 255 years. Let's talk about the Boston Massacre story. The descriptions of the event of that Monday evening are so contradictory that it really is difficult to get an accurate sense of what really happened. And there's many reasons for this. The first was the need to control the narrative right from the beginning. Radicals such as Sam Adams and others wanted to set the narrative to advance a political agenda. And second, the British Empire wanted to protect its image and assert control over its increasingly rebellious colony. And its national pride is shown here by this emblem, the royal emblem, especially through its Boston loyalist sympathizers, was at stake. And finally, Paul Revere, a clever businessman, wanted to make money from the event. So let's talk about how the narrative about the Boston Massacre was created, and this will tell you something about how stories I found are told in court. And I'll share with you one insight that I developed after trying 450 cases. Actually, very few people in court lie. Yeah, most of them don't lie. Yes, a good percentage of them do. But most of them don't lie. What they do is they convince themselves of a particular story. They've told the story to their husbands or wives or partners or friends or whatever. And that story gets embedded in their brain as to what really happened. They shape their perception according to their own preconceptions about things. So let's see what happens here. The event begins in confusion. The basic facts are unclear. Witnesses are trying to make sense of what just has happened. The next step is each side constructs a different narrative. The colonists on one side and the loyalists in the British Empire on the other. And in so doing, that each side highlights some aspects of the event and suppresses others. They try out various scenarios and views, and they gradually develop a coherent interpretation of what happened that night. That's what we see in trials, too. As we all know, our minds don't recall everything that we see in an objective fashion, particularly in moments of stress. If you've witnessed something, that was unexpected, our minds pick up patches of highly subjective impressions. That's what happens. And it is only through a narrative that a dramatic episode develops into a particular form that can be remembered, interpreted, and argued. The Boston Massacre case offers a perfect example of how flashes of memory gradually develop into competing narratives. What do I mean by that? First, let me ask you the question, rhetorically. Was it a Boston Massacre? Well, in today's use of the term used means a high body count. But actually, in the 18th century, the term massacre could be applied to even one individual who was killed, if the death was committed with cruelty and atrocity. And here, Samuel Adams, who was a skilled political strategist and propagandist, employed the phrase as political rhetoric. And here is how he portrayed the event in an obviously inflammatory manner. 5 caskets, a particular account of the most barbarous and horrid massacre committed in King Street, Boston on Monday, March 5th, by the soldiery quartered in said town. By comparison, how did the British see this? Well, their political allies produced a pamphlet with this title: A Fair Account of the Unhappy Disturbance, extracted from depositions, etc., in the town of Boston, with an appendix. An unhappy disturbance in which 5 men were killed, and a bunch of others were wounded. The townspeople of Boston shaped the narrative to focus on their long-standing complaints about the town's occupation by the British soldiers. They viewed the event as a culmination of the unjust encroachment upon their rights. Perhaps the most powerful propaganda weapon in the colonists' arsenal was a simple sketch. And you have those on the front of your booklets. That sketch, which has come down through history, and you've probably all seen it before. It was supposedly drawn by Paul Revere and widely distributed by him throughout the colonies and down through history. And to this day, this is how we remember the Boston Massacre. But the engraving is not without controversy. Revere's image is created to express outrage at the acts of the British troops and to solicit support for the patriot cause. This is the first image created by Revere. The images of the confrontation, you can see the British soldiers are lined up, in soldierly fashion, facing defenseless, innocent townspeople. That's not at all what happened. And Preston didn't even give the order. Preston didn't even give the order. The images of the confrontation between the soldiers and the townspeople are significant and visually compelling, as you can see, but historically inaccurate. Revere influences public opinion by depicting that line of redcoats firing point blank into a defenseless crowd. There was no organized military action, as we've talked about, and the soldiers were actually facing an unruly mob of about 60 to 100 people. Paul Revere actually stole his sketch from a fellow Boston painter and engraver by the name of Henry Pelham. Does that look similar? Yeah, because that's the original sketch. And Pelham and Revere shared a workplace. They were not business partners. But when Pelham was out of the shop once, Revere went over to his workspace, meaning Pelham's, and discovered this sketch that Pelham had been working on, and misappropriated his, meaning Pelham's sketch, work as his own, and changed it slightly. See if I can put them. And that's Pelham's sketch. They look somewhat similar, don't they? And there's the two differences. Pelham's is on the left and Revere's is on the right. Working from Pelham's rendition, Revere creates, advertises, and issues his own version, calling it the Bloody Massacre. And he issues it ahead of Pelham's. Pelham angrily complains in writing to Revere, telling him, "When I heard that you was cutting a plate of a late bird, I thought it impossible, as I knew you was not capable of doing it unless you copied it from mine, and I thought I had entrusted it in the hands of a person who had more regard to the dictates of honor and justice than to take the undue advantage you have done of the confidence and trust I reposed in you. So Henry Pelham lost out on fame and fortune because Paul Revere stole his print and got it out into the marketplace first. Although there were no laws protecting intellectual property at the time, what Revere did was unseemly at best and thievery at worst. And moving on to, there's one more important person in this drama that we focus on today. The first person killed that Monday night in the Boston Massacre, and the first death in the American Revolution, Crispus Attucks. As historians can best determine, Attucks, although a sailor in port that night, originally was born in Framingham, of African and Native American descent. Town records, which I've seen, describe him as being a slave of Deacon William Brown. And it is thought that he ran away from Brown's homestead and became a sailor and whaler working either at sea or around the docks on the eastern seaboard. During that fateful evening of March 5th, Attucks was part of a group of men who approached the townhouse armed with clubs, and as you saw, Attucks struck a British soldier with a piece of wood. For it, he took 2 bullets in the chest, killing him instantly. Now, there's one interesting sidelight of this particular story. Even though we know that there were indeed slaves, and the laws were not particularly enlightened with regard to race relations at the time, the interesting fact is that despite his race, everybody knows or should know that blacks were buried in their own kind of cemetery and whites were buried in their kind of cemetery, whites versus cemetery versus blacks. But to accord the recognition to Crispus Attucks, his body was carried along with all the other dead people to Faneuil Hall, where it lay in state with all the other victims for 4 days. And notably, I think, it should show how people were respecting him. The body, his Attucks' body, was buried along all the other victims with the middles of the Boston Massacre at the Granary Burial Ground. You know where that is? It's on Tremont Street. I find it enlightening and kind of makes you feel good to know that they were all accorded the same respect. Remember, this is 255 years ago. So, who won? Oh, by the way, this is the gravestone that shows Crispus Attucks' name. 4th name down. And the final fellow was a young man, Patrick Carr, who died several days later of injuries. Pretty severely wounded. Dr. Joseph Warren tended to him, but he was too far gone. So, who won the battle for the narrative? Who won the battle for the narrative? What do we call this event? Yeah, the very fact that we call it the Boston Massacre means that the colonists won out. And that's the judgment, their judgment about the event endured. And what are the lessons of the Boston Massacre? First, it has been repeatedly invoked for over 2 centuries to describe when the government misuses its power against its citizens. Secondly, it started the American Revolution. As historian, author, and my former colleague on the bench, Hilla Zobel, who studied the Boston Massacre and wrote a book about it, the seminal book on it, has declared the trial was a propaganda battle. To sum up, the Boston Massacre was a seminal event in the lead up to the break from independence from England. The story has many facets. The trials tell the story of conflicting evidence, the role of reasonable doubt, and whether someone could get a fair trial despite citizen hysteria. One point is clear: by its happening, the American Revolution was coming. And now as the radio personality, I don't know if you remember him, Paul Harvey used to say, and now for the rest of the story. One of the British soldiers, Pierce Butler, he was not among the charged at the Boston Massacre, but was part of that regiment, left the army, moved to South Carolina, and became a plantation owner. Fast forward 17 years, from 1770 to 1787, he became a member of the Continental Congress, which drafted the United States Constitution. And here is his signature on the United States Constitution, one of the British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre. And finally, if you were to visit the site of the Boston Massacre today, be aware that that's what you see in the National Park Service tour of the area. That is not at all where the massacre occurred. Okay? I am so tired. I used to come out for lunch from this alleyway here, and I see a collection of 40, 50, 60 tourists surrounded around some young kid who really didn't know his history. And they'd say, and this is where they fell. And I'd say, excuse me, sir, this is not where they fell. This is where the altercation between the apprentice, wigmaker's apprentice, and Montgomery happened. But it actually occurred almost 100 yards, well, a good 50 to 75 yards away, in front of 60 State Street, right on the other side of the street, not near there at all. Even the recreation that I found for you, which was one of the better ones, there's about 5 of them out there. They're all horrible. But even that one showed the soldiers coming from that direction. They did not come from that direction. They came from this direction. But in any event, those the city of Boston, why did they move it? Well, the traffic congestion. Okay. They wanted to widen Congress Street, so they just put it in a convenient little, whatever. So much for historical accuracy. So that's our story. I would recommend there's a bibliography in the materials that I handed out to you. The 2 best books, the best book is Hilary Zobel's called The Boston Massacre. He wrote that, he wrote it years before it was published in 1970. And I was quite surprised in 2017, Eric Hinderaker wrote a book called Boston's Massacre, which is a regurgitation of what Hilary Zobel did 55 years ago. All right? Does that sound familiar? We have a copying problem in the story. But I've read his, there's almost nothing different from it. And even the title, Boston's Massacre versus the Boston Massacre. So, in any event, I want to thank you for your attendance and attention this evening. Thank you very much. Happy to entertain any, yes.
I have 2 questions. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I grew up so I'm familiar with the.
You grew up where?
Lexington.
Oh,
So
okay.
I'm familiar with.
So you're gonna go over to the battle arena? You've been so, you know, the only thing about the Lexington Green is, I took my sons over there when they were really small, well, 5 and 8. And it's historically, chronologically accurate, so you have to get there like 4:45 in the morning. I hate that, just do it at 11, you know? But that's Lexington for you, you know, everything has to be, correct.
I've, of course, heard of the Boston Massacre, but I was not familiar with the trial afterwards, so this was very interesting.
Okay.
The questions I had were up in your notes that said Rex versus Weems.
Right.
Who's Weems?
Weems was one of the soldiers that was charged.
Okay.
Rex meaning the king versus Weems. That's how all British law cases were Rex versus, probably to this day, if it's a criminal case.
All right, because the capital's precedent, so I'm sure.
Yeah.
And the second question, I was surprised that the soldiers were charged.
Well, they're the ones
Why-
who actually did it.
But why, I mean, usually if you're under British law, I suppose, or are they operating under?
No British law. We had no American law at the time. No, good point.
Even the British law as a soldier, you charged with murder.
Well, apparently the Boston colonists thought so, right? You know, yeah. They,
So I was surprised.
yeah, they actually, well, you know, Preston really didn't do anything wrong. And yet he was charged with manslaughter. But the ones who actually, you know, fired, I mean, you know, technically they're the ones who did it. Just because you're a soldier doesn't mean you escape prosecution for, you know, an illegal act or an illegal killing. And I'm not saying it wasn't illegal killing. I mean, they were just, the truth of it is, a lot of these kids in the British regiment, they were just kids. They had been dragooned into the British military. They were from Ireland. Most of them went back to Ireland afterwards and tended to their farms. But they were dragooned into the regiment. I'm not saying I feel sorry for them, just telling you that's the way it was. But they were charged by the colonists. Yeah. Yeah. You know, don't forget, you've got a hysterical citizenry looking for blood. It's all revved up by this Sam Adams.
I'm just surprised that they just said, the king says it's okay. That's it.
Yeah, I think,
Occupiers, that you get charged by the people.
yeah, I think you've raised a very interesting question. How come the British king wasn't more hands-on on this thing? The truth of it is, we were like a little tiny problem for the British Empire at the time. Obviously, it became a conflagration, but they had problems with India at the same time and some of their other colonies. So, you know, we think that we were they were focusing all of their energy and attention on us. They couldn't have cared about Boston at the time. You know, and don't forget, most people, even in New England, didn't want to break from England at the time. That really took years in the making. South Carolinians thought that we people from Boston were crazy. They did. Even Virginians, they didn't want to necessarily originally break from England. They just wanted more satisfactory trade terms and a loosening of the king's yoke, so to speak, on their people in New York. They didn't want to break away. If you ever get a chance to read David McCullough's book, 1776, it really explains what was the mindset of most colonists at the time. They really had to be led to the idea of independence. And another thing to burst, and you probably know this and confirm it for me if you don't mind. When Paul Revere said, what did he say when he was riding around? The British are coming. No, he actually didn't say that at all. Everybody thinks he said it. He said the regulars are out because they all considered themselves British subjects at that time. So to say the British are out means, you know, my neighbor's out. No, they said the regulars are out. The regular army of the British Empire. Any other questions? Yes.
I wonder, in my own lifespan, there's been a couple of dramatic cases. I'm thinking Kent State and
Yeah.
I'm forgetting his name in Vietnam. The
My Lai Massacre. Yeah.
There's
William Calley.
Yes, Calley, that's right. And more recently, in
The Abu Ghraib.
yeah, yes, and also the riots of that happened after George Floyd and back in the 60s.
Yeah.
Anyway, are all these cases about massacres, is it sort of in any way similar? Is it the narrative that's really, as a judge, how do you deal with the inflamed passions that are circulating around these cases?
It's a very good question. I try not to get caught up in that sort of stuff, you know, and usually I'm pretty successful at it. You know, we have to be dispassionate, and let me just give you a little insight into the way we look at things. You got two sides to a controversy, right? Neither side is usually correct. Some of this is correct, some of this is correct. The truth is usually somewhere in the middle. And that's the job of a judge, is to try to, when you're doing a jury waived case. And I just did a very difficult mediation where there were competing interests. It was a very sensitive case. Very sensitive case with a lot of emotions. And I had to figure out, where does emotion drive the narrative and where doesn't it? And it took me 2 months to parse it out. And I just issued my decision. It was 75 pages just on March 4th, the day before the Boston Massacre anniversary. In any event, so you really have to be very careful. You don't swallow what everything that everybody says. You just have to figure out, well, wait a minute, that doesn't really seem like it flows from this event. And you take it apart and then put it back together and issue your decision. So they're troublesome cases for judges. I'll just let you in on one of the inside baseball thing about trial judges. Every September we get, in the Superior Court, we get a sheet of paper asking us what kind of cases we want to do for the next year. Do you want to do civil cases? Do you want to do high profile cases? Do you want to do murder cases? Do you want to sit in this particular court? And oftentimes your requests are granted, but oftentimes, for example, I preferred to do civil because I had done enough criminal cases down in the district courts. I'd been there for 3.5 years. And I kind of got I figured out, usually somebody who's alleged to be bad did something wrong, and okay, so it's not rocket science. But I found the civil side far more interesting and intellectually challenging. But one of the things that I did not want to do when the list was sent around, some of the judges would put in they wanted to do high profile, meaning TV cases. To be honest with you, I don't really care about those cases. But so when you see judges on TV, handling these local cases, they've asked for these cases. I just thought I'd share that thought with you. Does that help you? Did that kind of answer your question a little bit? Not really.
Yes, it does.
It does.
You haven't had to serve on any of these. It sounds like.
No, I've arbitrated though. I did 5 arbitrations, for example, in the last year on similar cases. These were child rape cases. All right. So no, I've handled enough profile cases down in the district courts, and I worked as the governor's legal counsel, so there's plenty of publicity if you really want to have it, and so I've done that. I've done that, and don't need to do it.
Somewhat related, if I could ask one more, is you had mentioned that some of the people killed had been drinking, and that they were probably drunk when they were attacked.
Well, I'm not saying they're drunk. The liquor was very thin at that time. It was very the beer was very weak. It'd take you 7 beers to equal 1 nowadays or something.
I guess I was just wondering, in the court, how does that weigh whether the victim, let's say in this case, was high or inebriated or whatever? I understand in some of the cases of the police shootings of the past couple of years, the victim turned out to be high or had some alcohol. But does the law ignore that, or does the law take any of that into account?
I don't know. It all depends on the facts of each case. I couldn't answer that generically. I couldn't answer that. If it affected their behavior, for example, if they're acting out, if they're acting out before the body cam goes on for the police officer, you do have to take that into account if you've got witnesses saying, oh no, this guy was acting cuckoo. I mean, there are people who are, pretty dangerous out there. And so It doesn't excuse I mean, I guess I don't know if you're asking me if it excuses their behavior, or do we take it into account in trying to understand the circumstances behind the initiation of a crime? And the answer is, yeah, we do. We take into account as much as we can, to try to figure it out.
Raised that too in the case. Did he ever mention that?
I don't think he, probably because the jury usually was going out for a couple of, casks or flasks, I should say, for lunch. It was just a, it was a way of life for those people. One of the things we don't appreciate these days is how hard a life these people had. You look around and, we've got, the Battle of Lexington and Concord is a perfect example. You had people who were coming in, walking from many distances to join the military, not the military, but the colonial patriots. And they didn't have Toyota Siennas or whatever to drive them around. Many of them came from, I was surprised to see that they came all the way from Connecticut. They just flooded the area. We take for granted all of our amenities, but they had a tough life. So when I say they had a tough life, if they drank too much in the evening, so be it. It's probably one of their little joys in life, so to speak. Okay? Yeah.
So I was sort of struck by how similar, at least within the context of the trial, that our legal system works today,
Yep.
following many of those things, and how some aspects in the Bill of Rights reflected
Yep.
what was happening here. That to me was quite interesting. Do you know of anything that was sparked by this trial that might have changed the approach that is reflected in?
Well, this is one of the few cases in which reasonable doubt was first raised in an American case. It really came to fruition in the case of the trial of Professor Webster Thayer in 1848 in the Commonwealth versus Webster case. That involved the murder and disappearance of the body of Dr. Parkman. Dr. Parkman was a Harvard medical professor and physician, and in a nutshell, this Dr. Webster owed money to Parkman. Parkman was a rather demanding collector. Even though he was a physician, he was really kind of a physician on the side. He was more of a real estate speculator and money loaner. And he, meaning Webster, couldn't pay him back, and so they had a tussle in Webster's chemistry lab over at the Harvard Medical School, and he killed Parkman, but then he butchered the pieces together. And that was the first case where circumstantial evidence was defined. The role of reasonable doubt was actually laid out, in a coherent fashion by the trial judge. And actually, there were 3 judges. In those days, they had 3 judges for murder cases. So to sum up the issue of what was brought forward, this lecture that I've given this evening is one of 23 that I have called Great Trials That Changed American History. Great Trials That Changed American History. And in each case, the course of history, excuse me. In each case, I take the theme of the case is what came out of that case that we see today. And you would be shocked at how many of these things, like the things that we say as trial judges, were determined 100 or 200 years ago. And you can look at the language, and it's almost word for word, just like the self-defense defense. In fact, one of the first cases that I do, the first trials that I focused on, was the trial of Socrates, which was in 299 BC. And people say, oh, that happened like 2,500 years ago. Well, the interesting thing is, the Greeks had a very interesting understanding of justice. They had a jury system. They had a prosecuting official. Even though you didn't have the right to count, they didn't have lawyers in those days, but you had a chance to say your piece. And I think the fundamentals of what really is fair and just carries forward to even to today. So, so I think the fundamentals of people, the upshot of these 23 trials is no matter what the facts are and what really is going on at the time, people really do not change terribly much. Human nature is the same. And people understood 499 BC what was a fair shot for a defendant. Actually, the truth of it is, Socrates probably could have escaped punishment if he had submitted to certain things, but that's another story for another day. They actually bifurcated the trial, which we do in death penalty cases today. They split the trial in two. They had two trials, one on guilt or innocence and a second on what's the appropriate punishment. We do the same thing today on all death penalty cases. They are bifurcated, two separate trials. That kind of answer your question? Yeah? Okay. I did as best as I could.
No, I think it's interesting that even the comments made by Adams at the trial, it's sort of everyone deserves a trial, but everyone has rights to a trial, rights to be heard, especially when you think of things in today's environment with people being shipped off without any recognition of whether they have any rights.
Right.
And others saying,
Get them out, they're bad people. Right. Did you have a question in the back?
Well, I was just
Thank you.
comment on how brave John Adams was to take up that cause, particularly. I think was his cousin.
Yeah, it was his cousin. Right.
And it's he's maybe seen as betraying the cause that he's been working toward.
True.
And also his own family. They're on opposite sides of this, and yet he's standing up for principle.
It is admirable, and that's one of the points of this evening's talk. But let me just share with you another insight that a lot of people are not aware of. Before he actually accepted the representation of Captain Thomas Preston, he met privately and quietly with many of the town leaders and opinion makers and said, look, I'm about to take this case. Basically, I'll just put it in normal language. Don't give me any crap. I'm just doing this because it's a job, okay? I'm not going to I'm not going to exaggerate the case. I'm just going to give the defense that the guy deserves. And so he kind of took the sting out of the people who would have reviled, and pushed the envelope against Adams personally. But nevertheless, the people who weren't in on that meeting had no idea, and they gave him a good ration of whatever. But he was brave for doing that, you're right. But it was also politically savvy of him to meet with the decision makers, the merchants and so forth, and say, look, this is what's going to happen. Yeah. No, I think somehow after their term had ended, a lot of these guys just went off back to Ireland. Oh, I think, don't forget, on March 17th, well, that was a couple of years later, they I don't know how long they were stationed in Boston or whether they rotated them out. I mean, if you're, Captain, General Gage, you're going to get these people on the ship and maybe get them out of there. I mean, you just protect your own, right? Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your time this evening.